The star of Sogam Taekwondo has 9 points and is 9 feet from center to top and 18 feet from top to bottom, representing the 18 forms or Poomsae of Sogam Taekwondo. The star conveys symmetry, which is essential in every form of Taekwondo. This symbol conveys the careful balance that is necessary for a life that is both ethical and rational, a balance that consists of harmony between competing yet complementary principles. Artists, philosophers, scholars, and martial artists have represented dualisms using their own terms for literally millennia. Dualism is the subject of this presentation, and Taekwondo, a very popular Korean martial art that I practice, provides an excellent case study for the necessity of a harmonious balance in one's life. For students, the point is also to show how effective this symbolism conveys the necessity of having an integrated and powerful offense and defense, complementary. Not everyone is a martial artist, although I would strongly recommend it. This presentation is intended also to illustrate how complex the philosophy is that underpins this sport. My argument is a correct form in Taekwondo encompasses a careful balance of movement and tension. The best defense is the best offense, as the maxim says. But just like the circle that is represented in the Korean flag, which I will discuss, it should only ethically serve self-defense. Art is expression through skill, and Taekwondo uses symbolism to convey abstract concepts just like other art forms. I have a doctorate in classical studies, and I have studied Greek philosophy, and I've studied for the past year Taekwondo, and I immediately appreciated from my classical background how sophisticated the philosophy and the symbolism was in Taekwondo, the philosophy that underpins this martial art and other disciplines that have inspired it and are related to it. Some people are really attached to their branch or sub-branch of martial arts, karate, kung fu, taekwondo. Really what matters the most is if you're on the way. In fact, you don't need to practice martial arts to be a truth seeker. So my chosen martial art is Taekwondo, but I don't think that Taekwondo is necessarily superior to Kung Fu or Karate. That's not the point. The point is to discuss the symbols of Taekwondo and observe how they translate into correct forms. So this is not necessarily a video for studying one particular form, but rather to understand the whole system. So I discussed the Sogam star and its 9 points. Symbolic itself because this is my 9th video on YouTube. The Koreans, alongside the Vietnamese, resisted ferociously Chinese domination and succeeded in some sense, but politics is one thing, culture is another. The symbol of and yang ultimately derives from Taoism. From China to Korea came the philosophy of Taoism. The yin and yang are two interdependent yet complementary forces that make up all aspects of life in the cosmos. Literally, yin means the dark side, while yang means the sunny side. One symbol for yin is a stream, while one symbol for the yang is a mountain. Notice also that these concepts are represented in a circle, a symbol itself for balance. So when I describe these concepts as ancient, they're really primordial, eternal in a sense, and every culture represents them in one form or another. Because, unsurprisingly, every culture, even those that haven't directly communicated with one another, you can see certain patterns show up, and every culture is or should be concerned with the way, a meaningful path in life, one that requires balance of competing forces. The taeguk on the South Korean flag in your dojang is not exactly original. It derives from the famous Taoist symbol of the yin and yang. In Korean, it is and yang, which constitute the taeguk, or supreme ultimate, which, as I noted, derives ultimately from the Taoist concept of a unity of opposites. According to Taoist philosophy, the cosmos consists of opposing yet complementary forces, and the way, a meaningful path through life, one with purpose, one that avoids confusing and misdirecting paths, requires a balance between these forces. In Karate Kid, Mr. Miyagi talks about the importance of balance, and there's some excerpts from the film in Cobra Kai. In the film, it's left to the viewer to interpret what he means by that. He doesn't, necessarily spell it out directly. But I can give you an example of what he means. So another dualism in mythology is between chaos and order. Too much order, that is, there is no element of chaos. There's no risk-taking. You're too scared, say, to pursue your destiny, your purpose in life. Your life will stagnate. On the other hand, too much chaos, say, no rules at all, or just completely ignoring all rules in society, that's dangerous. That could put you in prison. So you do need some kind of balance. Ancient Korea was a cultural colony of China. This is not uncommon in history. When one culture exerts a preponderance of influence. When Greek culture arrived in Rome long before the days of Julius Caesar, it was like a flood that couldn't be stopped. Rome was influenced by Greek culture in all aspects, architecture, literature, etc. Same for England and France. The English kings even spoke French as their first language for many centuries. So it's not uncommon, and China was a cultural powerhouse in East Asia. So the symbol derives from Taoism. The circle in the flag of South Korea symbolizes balance in the universe. The red half represents the positive cosmic forces, and the blue half represents the opposing negative cosmic forces. And it's interesting that the circle itself is meant to represent the people of Korea. That is, it should ideally represent the people of Korea. So it's a very sophisticated way of conveying the way a harmonious balance in one's life. It's a very eloquent flag. As far as flags go, a lot of them suck, to put it bluntly. Like, there's a lot of boring flags in the world. The South Korean flag is not a boring flag. Dr. Jordan Peterson is an analytical psychologist, and I read parts of his book, Maps of Meaning, for my dissertation. He describes the way as the path of life and its purpose. Johnny Lawrence in Cobra Kai has strayed from the path when he gives in to jealousy, bitterness, envy, and anger. But he is arguably the most interesting character in Cobra Kai because he's smart enough and good enough to glimpse the path and to try to get back on the path. And stories of redemption are powerful. But the Tao prescribes the way as opposite of other ways that are confusing and lack meaning. So, bridging cultural gaps here, Dante's Inferno, written by Dante Alighieri. If you're an American, at some point in high school, you probably read excerpts of the Divine Comedy, probably from Dante's Inferno. These are the first three lines. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway's been lost. So who hasn't strayed, like who is perfect, who hasn't strayed from the path at least once? No one, because we're not perfect. And the reason why he describes it as our life is because he's every man, he's every person who is, undertaking the journey of life. So I haven't finished Cobra Kai, but it is neat to see Johnny Lawrence attempt to return to the way, as Dante does in the Divine Comedy. This is the motto of Cobra Kai. 3 declarative statements that are bound together by this basic premise. Your enemies are ruthless, and so you also must be ruthless. The argument is deeply flawed, but I don't think it's without merit. The initiation of force is unethical, but if someone has attacked you, legally speaking, you don't have to wait to be hit to defend yourself. That's actually dangerous. Having said that, going macro for a moment and looking at the big picture. In history, war criminals have used the preemptive strike to drag their countries into rotten wars. Taoism's idea of balance, I think, can avoid straying into these two extremes. But striking first makes sense if someone is posing an imminent threat to you. So the second one, strike hard, this one also makes sense to a degree. If a fight is prolonged, there's greater risk for injury and death to both combatants. Here's another example from history. The nastiest war that I've read about was the truceless war between Carthage and their mercenaries after Carthage lost the war against Rome. They didn't pay their mercenaries, and one atrocity led to another atrocity. The war essentially was a downward spiral into complete depravity. So again, balance is the key. The Greek motto, which we see inscribed on columns outside of Delphi, was nothing to excess, and so the Greeks and the Chinese were talking essentially about the same philosophy here. No mercy is the most complicated. I respect that Taekwondo is based on karate, but I don't have any sentimental attachment to Japan. sentimentality is not truth-seeking. So, the single worst atrocity that I've read about was the sack of Nanking by the Japanese Imperial Army in 1937. In fact, it was so bad that a member of the Nazi Party actually complained to Hitler about the absolutely deplorable conduct of the Japanese. The Japanese army was motivated by this fatalistic kind of psychopathy. In fact, in my view, it was a perversion of Bushido, which I actually think is worthy of respect. But what if someone like that attacked you? What does yes mercy mean in that context? The German army was way more effective and more advanced than the Japanese, and except for the Waffen-SS, they were fanatics. But like the average German soldier from like some village in Bavaria was, in general, I think, less nihilistic, if that's the right word, than his Japanese counterpart. But if someone attacked you who is motivated by pure nihilistic destruction, that's no mercy in practice. So the next question is no mercy actually effective? Well, did the Japanese win World War II? And going back to Cobra Kai, would John Kreese describe the Vietnam War as a success? I would describe it as a tragic mistake. So this is an historical fact. The Japanese invaded Korea in the 16th century, and the Japanese didn't go home when the Koreans asked them to politely. They went home because they were defeated through the use of force. Primarily at sea, the samurai, ultimate warriors they may be, but sailors they are not. I would say strike first, strike hard, if justice will prevail in your hands, or feet, depending on the target's distance. But to be serious about this, I would say I would add to it, then only when absolutely necessary. So lastly on this Cobra Kai segment, Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution essentially renounces war. As it says in the Constitution, renounces war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. And one website maintained that the Japanese Constitution is the longest unamended constitution. It's not. They reinterpreted the Constitution in any case because Article 9 was untenable for the self-defense of Japan's allies. So it's a distinction without a difference, and Japan's attempt to cover up Nanking was pure cowardice. So Article 9 is easy to write in after you've tried to take over the world and someone else is defending your country for you. It's unsophisticated, and it reminds me of Miguel's mother early in the Cobra Kai series when she says that she does not approve of violence. What does that mean in effect? When someone says, I don't approve of violence, basically it means that you're okay with good people putting their bodies on the line to keep society safe so that you can feel better than them sitting on your moral pedestal. And some people might say that Germany falls into the same case as Japan. It doesn't. It's not even close. West Germany had 1 million men on the front lines for their defense during the long Cold War. And in my view is probably the most responsible foreign policy, a balance between Japan's extreme pacifism and America's belligerence. I would say that's Germany, a balance that's metaphorically represented in Cobra Kai between Mr. Miyagi and Daniel Russo. On the right is Sun Man Lee executing a perfect sidekick in one of his Poomsae in my Taekwondo manual. So the Poomsae, the forms, include a number of dualisms. They are sequences of moves that include both offense and defense, exercise the left and right sides of your body. Normally you don't do one move more than twice, and you end up where you started. And you have to train your mind and body to do them correctly. And I'll discuss later what I mean by tension and movement. But the goal ultimately is symmetry, as I discuss with the Sangam Star and with the Taeguk, the Umenyang. On the right is an illustration of the Japanese invasion of Korea. The national clothing of the Koreans, by the way, is white, hence the white flag on the South Korean flag. Notice the soldier in the lower left using the bow. The bow itself is a good symbol for tension and movement. You have to knock the bow, which requires tension. You have to be pretty strong to use a longbow, especially the bows that the English used. And then movement is when you let go and loose the arrow at the target. It's a metaphor for tension and movement. So as I noted earlier, art is expression through skill. The medium of martial arts are essentially combat skills, but it is an art form. Taekwondo may have been organized relatively recently, but its roots derive from ancient Korea. And there is an obvious connection to warfare, which is likely why the Japanese, 3 centuries later, when they occupied Korea briefly, they banned martial arts, because probably it served as a means of not just training young men to potentially resist the occupation, guerrilla warfare, but it was also a means of organizing political resistance. It was a group of men training. So, and you've probably seen the military tone in your dojo if you do karate or if you practice taekwondo. You'll notice the military tone. So briefly, in 1955, the Korean general Chi sought to unify the various martial arts of Korea into an organized system, which he termed taekwondo. In 1956, our eternal grandmaster Lee, who founded ATA Taekwondo, this is the taekwondo that I practice, or Sangam Taekwondo is what I practice. The organization is ATA. He served as a trainer in the Korean Army. Later, he founded Sangam Taekwondo in 1983. This leads to my last comparative study, that is tying Taekwondo back to its martial origins. So Taekwondo means literally the way or discipline of the foot and the fist. So the way can also mean discipline. So getting back to the military roots of Taekwondo, military systems are not necessarily philosophical. In fact, they can commit egregiously unethical acts, atrocities. But in order to be effective, they have to adopt a doctrine that is somewhat approximate to the way that I've been talking about. So my specialty is really the Roman army. And the Roman military doctrine is actually a good mindset to have for Taekwondo tournaments. So as one scholar puts it, Adrian Goldsworthy, the Roman tactical doctrine was based upon the offensive, and I'll be talking about the interplay in just a moment between defense and offense. But the Roman army always sought to bring the conflict to a decisive conclusion as quickly as possible by seizing the initiative and dictating the course of the fighting. A decision was reached when the enemy's will to fight was broken. So that's a bit intense for Taekwondo tournaments. It's not meant to replicate a fight exactly, but my instructor, Mr. Taft, always notes that if you kick someone in the head, it's always demoralizing. And the Roman army, because of their discipline, relentlessness, they could really demoralize opponents because they were difficult to defeat, not just because they were well organized, but they themselves would refused to yield, even after catastrophes like Cannae during the Second Punic War. So they were aggressive. But it's also important that the Roman army spent considerable time, a massive amount of time, constructing, after every single march, a systematically organized walled encampment for a variety of reasons beyond the scope of this presentation, but that is discipline. Furthermore, they fought in this very complicated checkerboard-like formation that also required a great deal of mental toughness and physical toughness and training, which kept almost 2/3 of the force outside of the initial charge, which later allowed them to rotate men in and out of battle. So it requires discipline and a deferral of gratification to adopt a system like that. This may be controversial, but I would say a true balance lies somewhere between Cobra Kai and Mr. Miyagi. Indeed, the Roman legions would probably be somewhere in between Mr. Miyagi and Cobra Kai, but they would definitely be closer to John Kreese and Cobra Kai just because of their very aggressive military doctrine and ruthlessness. And the idea of the Roman army as some kind of group of robots is inaccurate. They had considerable swagger, maybe too much swagger, according to some Roman generals, and definitely more than an instructor like Mr. Miyagi would approve of. Nevertheless, it's hard not to respect the ferocity and the esprit de corps of Cobra Kai, which is getting back to that military tone of martial arts. And you also have the feeling watching Karate Kid that if it weren't for lawsuits from parents, the instructor, John Kreese, would probably have amped up the discipline. Would that have made students learn faster and compete better in tournaments? The answer is yes. Nevertheless, is that the Tao? Is that the way? No, it is not. That's not the pursuit of wisdom that is leading, an ethical and rational life of balance. That is not the way. So if you do Taekwondo or Karate, tournaments are interesting. They're a pursuit of excellence. The Greeks would call that arete. But they're not everything, because some people are just going to be overmatched. The most important thing is to pursue, wisdom and be on the path. So Johnny Lawrence in Karate Kid, if he had won the tournament in 1986, I'm not sure that he would have ended up in a different place than at the beginning of Cobra Kai. He probably still, given his life at that time, he probably still would have had the downward spiral that we see at the beginning of Cobra Kai in any event. So to reiterate, not everyone is going to have the athleticism to win at tournaments. Tournaments are good, but ethics, values are accessible to everyone, and that really is the most important thing, and accessible including to Johnny Lawrence. So more to the point, if you believe that martial arts is about fighting, then you've lost the plot. If you believe that it is about winning medals, you've lost the plot. So don't worry, we will get to footage of, Taekwondo kicks and punches, but we're looking primarily at the philosophy in this presentation. And so, very briefly, I'm going to bridge cultures here and look at Greek philosophy and see how it lines up pretty well with the philosophy of Taekwondo. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living, and if you do martial arts, you are forced to examine where you are. The term philosophy derives from the Greek philosophia, the love of wisdom, and to put it as simply as possible, philosophy is the study of ethics, of values, if you will. And when you start to see the patterns, the main ideas across cultures, you do start to see who is a truth seeker and who isn't seeking truth. So when I first started Taekwondo, I did get goosebumps when I started to notice that the key to the training was forms. And how does Plato, the founder of Western philosophy, say to pursue wisdom? Forms. That is exactly the term that he uses. Forms. To pursue wisdom. And forms in his sense are eternal, a category of eternal ideas like justice, truth, beauty, wisdom, etc. Forms in Greek is idea, from which we derive the term idea. So, and there is this, once again, another dualism in Greek philosophy of mind and body, which does come up in your Poomsae. At one point, Plato says, what is it that, when present in a body, makes it living? A soul. Aristotle is hard to read, but basically the point is the mind and body are inseparable, which is the concept behind the and yang on the Korean flag in your dojang, that the positive and negative are together, a unity of opposites. So the mind and body in your Taekwondo Poomsae, you have the blocks, the kicks, the punches, but the mental element is also important. Concentration, ethics, strategy. Meditation improves focus. Meditation is actually a good side skill to develop while you're doing Taekwondo, because if you're not focused, it's easy to mess up in tournaments and in testing. It's easy to mess up doing simple stuff, like sometimes instructors will say chariot and kune, which is to stand to attention and bow. Sometimes they'll just say chariot and see if students are listening and paying attention. The technique of meditation is relatively simple. It's about deep breathing and noticing when you're lost in thought. It's hard to go even a short amount of time without becoming lost in thought. The correct way to do it is just to notice it and then resume breathing. But the thoughts will continue to pop into your mind. The trick is to notice it and watch the thought dissipate. But it's good training, good mental training for focus, which improves your defense. The fight scenes in a lot of martial arts films like Karate Kid and Cobra Kai are a little OCD in how well they've been choreographed. I don't see tournament sparring going exactly like that, but focus nonetheless is a useful tool. The best part of the classic Roman era film Spartacus 1960 with Kirk Douglas is the training part, which is the first third of the film. So the Lanista, Lentulus Pietius, he's kind of like Johnny Lawrence in a way. He goes on this journey of redemption The main star is, of course, Spartacus on the right. Draba, the Ethiopian gladiator at the beginning, is a heroic figure. He's forced to match up against Spartacus, but he sacrifices himself. But Lentulus, who trains gladiators, is a guy who glimpses the way but is not on the way. He's kind of like John Kreese in a way. He's right when he says a good body with a dull brain is as cheap as life itself. You have to exercise both the mind and the body. The forms in Taekwondo include both defense and offense. Kicks are the specialty of Taekwondo. Speed, flexibility, but also it's important, again, the complementary balance between offense and defense. You should view every block as a strike. So it's very offense-oriented, which returns us to the maxim, the best defense is the best offense. And yet the best offense, to reiterate once again, morally, serves your defense. Initiating the use of force is unethical. Here I am. Here's an example of what not to do. So if you linger on a knife hand strike in middle stance in Sangam 4 so long that your instructor feels like he's aging, you're not doing the form correctly. Nonetheless, observe again the balance between tension and movement. So once I resume the form, notice the wedge block from the knife hand strike. The rotation in so many moves is key. That's the movement part. And then the tension is at the end of the transformation. But a lot of moves, knife hand strikes, blocks, kicks, they involve a rotation, which is where the power comes from. So this is footage from testing at my dojang. Observe in these Poomsae the balance between tension and movement. Movement is when your body is transforming itself into a weapon. Too much movement, your transformations are incomplete and weak. Tension is when the transformation is complete. At the point of impact, you should have strength behind your strikes. But too much tension, and your body will literally break down. Like mental tension in terms of anxiety at a tournament is not the Tao. You'll exhaust yourself. Also physically, when you're doing your forms, if you tense up, that's not good for your body. So balance really appears like poetry. Poetry, if you're doing it correctly, not the rhyming stuff that poetry does nowadays, but like the Greeks and the Romans. The syllables in a line were metrical. They were fit to a very specific meter. And it was like singing. That's why they talk about poetry as singing. And poems in ancient Greece and Rome were read aloud in public. And it would be weird if the poet just stopped in the middle of the meter and delayed. It would disrupt the melody. It's like singing. Likewise, when you're doing Poomsae, if you linger too much on a transformation, you've disrupted the poetry of what you're doing. That's not the correct way to do a Poomsae. How do you do correctly the Poomsae is to do them repeatedly until you do them correctly. Let's do a case study within a case study on smart defense. Even if your blocks are perfectly executed, you never quite know what an opponent is going to do. The best defense in an actual self-defense situation is an opponent that's incapacitated. In tournaments, the object is not to hurt the opponent. It's not to replicate an actual fight. The object is to score points, not to hurt your opponent. With that said, at a tournament, defense is necessary, but keep this in mind. A perfect block scores exactly 0 points. You have to have an offense in order to win. Furthermore, in a self-defense situation, going beyond self-defense is not only illegal, but unethical, as you're entering the realm of vengeance and leaving the realm of justice. In fact, number one should probably be avoiding, within reason, fights altogether. And what I mean by that is just like avoiding dangerous crowds, hanging out with the wrong people, immoral people when you're growing up is even better than having to knock someone out in combat. Sometimes you have to do that, but it's like exercise common sense and have good people in your company. You are the measure of the company that you keep. So that would actually be number one. But moving on to number two, Returning to the tournaments, movement is essential to your defense because, again, you don't know exactly what the opponent is going to do, so shifting your feet and moving around is the best defense because avoiding a strike altogether, the opponent misses. That reduces the chance of a hit landing. Even better than a block is causing the opponent to miss entirely, which depends on stances and movement and moving your feet and not staying in one place. So obviously blocks are an important part of defense, but without forms and training, your technique may be perfect, but you may not have enough strength to actually deflect the blow, and that's where those rotations come in. When you're doing the forms, like with the wedge block, you turn your wrists outwards, which deflects the blow, and same with the knife hand strikes and other strikes. Blocks definitely may prevent your opponent from scoring points. In self-defense situations, a block may not only prevent injury, but save your life. So this is why every block may also be described as a strike. Again, the complementary nature of offense and defense. So the same principles of balance that I've been talking about are also present in other sports. So one of my favorite teams in basketball are the Detroit Pistons from the 1980s. They're known as the Bad Boys. So were they the Cobra Kai of the NBA? Kind of. They weren't the villains, though. I think that's an exaggeration. They did have this extremely physical defense, but it was also a smart defense. And they crafted the famous Jordan rules against Michael Jordan, and they were able to defeat him in the playoffs 3 years in a row. But they would not have won 2 championships if all they had was thuggery, hitting people. In fact, the interplay between defense and offense also comes up more directly in football when the defense is actually executing an offensive strike against the opposing team, known as a tackle. But the Pistons won championships because of defense and offense. So the Pistons had an innovative offense. They had a center who could shoot three-pointers. This was before Dirk Nowitzki was shooting three-pointers. They had Bill Laimbeer, and they also had a 3-guard rotation. So they had offense and they had defense. And overall, Isaiah Thomas is an underrated player, but his all-time record against Michael Jordan is 36 wins and 29 losses, and he's a 2-time champion. And it's interesting because when he won the championship, he said, "It feels like heaven." So like with the Taekwondo tournaments, the World Championships, and the Olympics, we should praise athletes, martial artists who are pursuing excellence, arete, pursuing the forms and getting as close as possible is almost divine, because these forms are a category of eternal concepts, but no human being is divine, though. And so I think that's dangerous when people start to hero worship certain people, like Michael Jordan, for example. Michael Jordan kind of reminds me of Daniel Russo from Cobra Kai. I like Russo. He is the protagonist, basically, in Karate Kid. He's a good guy. He's on the path, basically. So was Jordan, kind of. But Jordan had an ego that is so big that it's really beyond the scope of this presentation. But, praise all these athletes pursuing excellence. But hero worshiping is dangerous. People are not divine. But the concepts, the forms, might be. Martial arts, especially the East Asian disciplines like Taekwondo, are probably more sophisticated than most students and perhaps even some instructors realize. Every form incorporates a balance between tension and movement, symbolically represented by the and yang on the South Korean flag. And it is really eerie, in a good way, when you see how close these Chinese philosophers and martial artists, and also the Greek philosophers, were getting to ultimate reality, even just simply through reason alone. Look at the structure of the atom, which the Greeks theorized correctly even before they had microscopes. But look at the protons and the neutrons, positive and negative forces, the unity of opposites. So, this is my school, Hockman ATA in Columbia, Missouri. I would recommend martial arts for both the mental and physical discipline. For me, at least, when I've committed to a class and I'm paying for it, it's a lot more reliable than exercising on my own. Those two factors really help to overcome the inertia that some people have with physical exercise, and it's a lot funner than the treadmill. So that will conclude the presentation. Thanks for listening.